The US government is preparing to ban TikTok, one of the most popular apps in the country. US President Joe Biden officially signed the law on the 24th of April, saying that the US government will ban TikTok unless the parent company of TikTok, the Chinese company ByteDance, agrees to sell it to a US company or another Western company. This is the latest example of the economic war that the United States is waging against China, and in particular against Chinese technology companies. Now, several weeks ago, when the US Congress approved this law, I published an analysis here in which I looked at how the US is waging a tech war on China and the real motivation behind Washington's ban on TikTok, which is aimed ultimately at protecting big tech monopolies in the US. Now that Biden has signed the law, the clock is ticking. TikTok only has 1 year, and its Chinese parent company, ByteDance, has said very clearly that it is not going to sell TikTok. So it's very likely that the US government is going to be banning this app. Again, one of the most popular apps in the country. It has 170 million users in the US, which is half of the entire population, and especially among young people in the US. So here is this analysis that I published. I updated it for the latest news so you can understand why this is so geopolitically important. The US is trying to prevent China from technologically developing, and TikTok is only one part of this larger technological war. The US Commerce Secretary, Gina Raimondo, made this clear as day back in 2021. She stated, quote, "If we really want to slow down China's rate of innovation, we need to work with Europe, calling to prevent China from technologically innovating." The US Commerce Secretary has since repeated comments like this multiple times. This March 2024, she said that the US will do whatever it takes to prevent China from getting access to the most advanced technology. Whatever it takes, she said. And in a press conference, she referred to China as the greatest threat the US has ever faced. It's not a coincidence that also in March, US President Biden called for an investigation into the so-called national security risks posed by Chinese electric vehicles. The Biden White House published an official statement claiming, quote, "Chinese automakers are seeking to flood the autos market in the United States and globally, posing new threats to our national security." Now, I don't think it's a coincidence that Biden made this statement just a few weeks after the billionaire oligarch Elon Musk, the CEO of Tesla, he said publicly that we need trade barriers because Tesla cannot compete with Chinese electric vehicles. And the European Union is doing exactly the same thing. The European Commission announced an official investigation into Chinese electric vehicles as part of a larger anti-dumping investigation. And their complaint is that China, the government, has subsidized the creation of electric vehicles as part of its industrial policy to transition toward renewable energy and green technologies. In fact, also this March, the EU announced that it is likely going to put retroactive tariffs on Chinese EVs. And of course, this came just a few weeks after Elon Musk called for trade barriers, and that's exactly what's happening. So here we're getting at the root of the issue. The West is waging a technological war on China, and their explicitly stated goal is to prevent China from catching up technologically, from advancing, and from competing with their own corporate monopolies. And really, it's the US corporate monopolies because Europe does not have a lot of big tech corporations. This is an attempt to save the monopolies in the US so they can continue to dominate the entire world, so there are no alternatives to US corporate domination. And furthermore, it's part of a larger geopolitical conflict in which the United States is trying to maintain its unipolar imperial control over the planet by making countries around the world dependent on its technology, on its apps, on its capital. India is a very clear example of this. India is governed by a far-right political party called the BJP, and its Prime Minister, Narendra Modi, is very anti-China and very pro-West. And for years, the US government has been trying to recruit India for its new Cold War on China, going back to the Barack Obama administration. Donald Trump did it as well, and Biden has continued working closely with India to try to contain China economically and politically. India has joined the Quadrilateral Security Dialogue, the Quad, which is an anti-China military bloc. And back in 2020, India banned 59 major Chinese apps, including TikTok. So India is really the test case here. And when US Congress members were arguing in support of banning TikTok, they cited India as an example. However, what was the result of banning TikTok in India? Well, it actually helped to solidify the control of US big tech monopolies over India, the most populous country on earth with 1.4 billion people. If you look at the market share of social media companies in India, they're all US social media companies, the top companies. Facebook, Instagram, which are both owned by Meta, YouTube, owned by Google, which is Alphabet, Twitter, Pinterest, and LinkedIn. These are all US big tech corporations. India does not have alternatives to US big tech corporations. So even calling this protectionism is a bit misleading. I mean, it is protectionist, but the real point of protectionism is you want to use trade barriers and tariffs and subsidies and such to help to develop your own local industries in the country so they can compete internationally. And finally, when they're able to compete, then you can lift some of those trade barriers and restrictions. This is what all of the Western powers did when they economically developed, as the South Korean development economist Ha Jun-chang has shown in his research, especially his book, Kicking Away the Ladder. All of the major Western countries economically developed, of course, through colonialism and slavery and war, but also through very large tariffs and protectionism, building up their local industries. But India doesn't have serious alternatives to these US big tech monopolies, and India is not protecting its own alternatives locally from the US companies. So it's not actually protectionism, it's economic war. It's technological war aimed at China. It's not all foreign companies that are being targeted, it's Chinese companies that are being targeted. And this is a concerted attempt led by the US and its allies and proxies to try to bankrupt and sabotage all of the Chinese competitors to its big tech monopolies. In fact, Forbes published a very revealing article back in 2023 titled, "Banning TikTok Would Boost Alphabet, Meta, and Snap. Here's how much their stocks could jump." So this really let the cat out of the bag. This is the financial press in the US salivating over the idea of banning competitors to US big tech monopolies. And that's not all. Back in 2022, the Washington Post reported that Facebook and its parent company Meta had hired dozens of PR firms across the United States to spread propaganda and disinformation to demonize TikTok, lobbying to get TikTok banned. Of course, because TikTok is one of the biggest competitors to Meta. And of course, Meta is the parent company of Facebook, of Instagram, and also of WhatsApp, one of the most popular messaging programs in the entire world. And of course, Meta's CEO is the billionaire oligarch Mark Zuckerberg. And Meta has many contracts, billions of dollars of contracts with different US government agencies. And what's particularly funny is that Facebook hired a political firm that is closely linked to the Republican Party, and they use conservative messaging to portray TikTok as a so-called Chinese communist threat, and also to portray TikTok as a threat to children in the US. Now, it's often forgotten, but back when Trump was president in 2020, he pledged that he was going to ban TikTok. Back in August 2020, Donald Trump signed an executive order referring to TikTok as a so-called national security threat. I'm reading here from Trump's executive order. The spread in the United States of mobile applications developed and owned by companies in the People's Republic of China continues to threaten the national security, foreign policy, and economy of the United States. Note how he singled out the economy in particular. He means a threat to U.S. big tech monopolies. And then Trump said in an executive order, quote, "Action must be taken to address the threat posed by one mobile application in particular, TikTok." NPR reported on this at the time with the headline, "Trump signs executive order that will effectively ban use of TikTok in the US." However, the reason that TikTok was not banned back in 2020 is because two different judges in US courts overturned Trump's executive order, saying that it was unconstitutional and that he could not ban TikTok. This is why it's especially hypocritical that now, in 2024, Trump has done a 180 and he claims to oppose banning TikTok. And of course, there are a variety of reasons that he's doing this. First of all, Trump is doing this because Biden is the one who's trying to ban TikTok. And Trump, with the election coming up, is trying to win support from young voters. Of course, TikTok is very popular among young people. Furthermore, Trump made this announcement that he's going to oppose the ban of TikTok after he met with a major conservative donor who is a hedge fund manager who's invested in TikTok. So it's part of the economic interests of his donors. And furthermore, Trump said that he opposes banning TikTok because it would strengthen Meta and Facebook, which he's also against. So, this is not motivated by some noble cause. The idea that it's about freedom of speech or something is nonsense, because Trump had no problem violating freedom of speech and signing an executive order trying to ban TikTok back in 2020 when he was president. So he's being extremely hypocritical and cynical. And if Biden bans TikTok, it's very likely that Trump will not reverse that order. But he's just, engaging in politics like all US politicians who are very deeply hypocritical. Now, I think it's really important to talk about that recent history, because one of the common narratives that we've been hearing recently is that the reason the US government is trying to ban TikTok is because it supposedly spreads anti-Israel propaganda, which is ridiculous. In fact, there have been studies that show that if anything, pro-Palestinian material is not promoted more than it's actually represented on the platform. The reason that there is so much pro-Palestinian material on TikTok is not because the algorithm promotes it. On the contrary, it's because most users on TikTok are young people, and young people are overwhelmingly pro-Palestinian and oppose Israeli apartheid and its war crimes against the Palestinian people and its colonialist policies. They're against colonialism and they're against racism, and they support the Palestinian people. But again, this is not simply about Israel-Palestine, because this most recent war in Gaza began back in October. But as I've showed today, for years now, the US government has been trying to find excuses to ban TikTok, and it's because of China. Now, you can say that maybe now with the war in Gaza, they have an excuse over Israel, and they can use the excuse that it's supposedly spreading anti-Israel propaganda. But the fundamental reason is that this is a U.S. economic war on China. And there are historical echoes of this. Back in the 1980s, the U.S. government was engaged in a similar economic war against Japan. And in fact, in 1987, Republican lawmakers outside the U.S. Capitol brought out sledgehammers and they destroyed a Toshiba stereo, a boombox from the Japanese company Toshiba. And at that time, back in 1987, the U.S. Congress was considering very similar legislation to ban the sale of Japanese products, in particular Toshiba computers. And the Washington Post published an op-ed back in 1987 titled, "Boycott Toshiba Computers, but don't let Congress force you." And the point of the article was, let the market operate. And instead of banning it, just tell people to boycott these Japanese products. And you know what also happened that same year in 1987? Ronald Reagan, the right-wing Republican, the godfather of neoliberal economic orthodoxy and free market fundamentalism, in that year, he imposed 100% tariffs on Japanese electronics products because US tech corporations were unable to compete with Japanese companies. And can you guess what the reason for this was? It was in a dispute over semiconductors, which is exactly what is happening again today. The Biden administration has passed several different measures banning the export of advanced semiconductors to China in what is being referred to as a chip war. And Washington's goal is to try to prevent China from developing and innovating in some of the most important cutting-edge technologies, such as artificial intelligence and quantum computing. The ultimate irony that I want to emphasize here is that the US government has spent decades imposing neoliberal economic orthodoxy on other countries, telling them that they have to privatize state assets and sell off companies to foreign investors, to foreign capital, in particular to US companies. But at the same time, the US government has been engaged in these economic warfare policies and protectionist policies when it's politically convenient and economically convenient for Washington. In fact, just a few months after Ronald Reagan put 100% tariffs on Japanese tech products in 1987, then in 1988, he gave a speech praising free trade. Reagan called for rejecting protectionism and talked about how one of the key factors behind our nation's great prosperity is the open trade policy, which of course is completely false. In reality, the US was one of the most protectionist economies on earth until World War II. And then when the US established its economic hegemony and domination of much of the world economy, then the US lifted its protectionist policies and preached free trade and free markets. Once again, economist Ha-Joon Chang has shown in his research in the book Kicking Away the Ladder the hypocrisy of the US and before that the British Empire. They always preach free trade when it's in their economic interest. But when it's no longer in their economic interest, they resort to protectionism and economic war. And this is exactly what we're seeing again today. The US is waging economic war on China and resorting to these protectionist policies that Washington has told the entire world to oppose. Back in the 1980s, as neoliberal economics became mainstream, that a better term is free market fundamentalism, under Ronald Reagan in the 1980s and also Margaret Thatcher in the UK, the US government imposed these policies on developing countries, formerly colonized countries, largely Latin America, and then also Asia and Africa. And this became solidified in 1989 in what was known as the Washington Consensus. And it shows how no one actually believes in this free trade fundamentalist neoliberal doctrine. It is a political tool imposed on other countries to prevent them from developing and prevent them from actually competing with the major corporate monopolies concentrated in the global north, in the imperial core, in particular in the United States. The US does not want China to compete. It claims it doesn't want a new Cold War. In Washington, they claim they only want competition with China, but they don't want competition with China. US Commerce Secretary Gina Raimondo said that very clearly. The US is working with the EU to slow down China's innovation rate, to prevent it from competing. And as she reiterated this March, Raimondo, the US Commerce Secretary, said that Washington is doing whatever it takes to prevent China from getting access to the most advanced technology. This is the goal of the US, which is hegemony, dominance, imperialism, to prevent other countries from developing their own high-tech industries so they are dependent on the United States, on US corporate monopolies, so they can extract the wealth of countries all around the world, so they can super exploit the labor of low-paid workers around the world, so other countries can never catch up to the same level of economic development. And the plans to ban TikTok are just part of this larger tech war and economic war. On that note, I'm going to conclude. I want to thank everyone for joining me today. I'm Ben Norton. This is Geopolitical Economy Report. Please like and subscribe, and I'll see you next time.